Alright, this is Numbers 15, Part 2 in the Prager Rational Bible. Let's begin. Alright, starts off with another essay. The difference between sinning in public and sinning in private. The case of the Israelite who publicly violated one of the 10 Commandments. Alright, verse 32. Once when the Israelites were in the wilderness, they came upon a man gathering wood on the Sabbath. 33. And those who found him as he was gathering wood brought him before Moses, Aaron, and the whole community. Now, this incident does not necessarily follow chronologically from the events described previously. Of course, ancient writing is not always linear. But it does follow thematically what was to be done in the case of an Israelite who publicly reviled God and his commandments, who mutinied himself against divine and human authority. Specifically, a man who was seen gathering wood on the Sabbath day. This was regarded as a particularly grievous sin. Why? Well, one logical, though unnoted reason is that the man was gathering wood, presumably in order to light a fire on the Sabbath, the only act in the Torah specifically prohibited on the Sabbath. And he's got a commentary on that in Exodus 35:3, so you can go read that for yourself again if you have your Exodus Rational Bible. And to understand the gravity of this act, one must understand three things. Number one, the Sabbath is the only ritual commanded in the 10 Commandments. And two, the Sabbath embodies the covenant between God and Israel. And three, the Sabbath is the most explicit way Jews bear witness to God as their Creator. And ultimately, Jesus is our Sabbath. We rest in Him. We don't have to earn our salvation. An Israelite who publicly gathered wood on the Sabbath, especially immediately after the 10 Commandments were given, was publicly renouncing Israel's covenant with God. Here's Exodus 31:16 through 17. The people shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout the ages as a covenant for all time. It shall be a sign for all time between me and the people of Israel. For in 6 days the Lord created the heaven and the earth, and on the 7th day he ceased from work and was refreshed. And so the wood gatherer's offense was so grave because he committed the offense in public. Gathering wood is an outdoor act, and no one went looking for Sabbath violators. They came upon the man doing so. And there's no provision in the Torah for instituting religious police or people who check on co-religionists' private religious behavior. So the violation of laws governing authority, known in Judaism as laws between a man and his neighbor, such as like theft and murder, they are to be uncovered and prosecuted, whether done in private or in public. Now, of course, you need to have 2 or 3 witnesses. And every society needs police in order to enforce basic ethical rules, but ritual laws, known as laws between man and God, are to remain between the individual and God when done in private. And no one is instructed to visit an Israelite's home on the fast day of Yom Kippur, for example, Day of Atonement, to check on whether the individual is fasting. However, if an Israelite were to eat in synagogue on Yom Kippur, the community would have every reason to, at the very least, have every reason to chastise the person. And the distinction between private and public sin is of great importance. It does not only apply to religious sin. Take improper speech, for example, using expletives and public is far more egregious than using such words in private. But of course it is still sin in private too. But anyway. And frequent use of expletives in private conversation can affect the character of the individual, and it can even be offensive for those subjected to it. But this is immeasurably less detrimental to the society than if one uses such words in public. And as a radio broadcaster, Prager was warned that deliberately using expletives during a broadcast could get him fired. Now, in America and presumably other countries, it is illegal to broadcast such words over the free public airwaves. It's legal for private radio and television station, that is, for broadcasts that people pay for. But this distinction should be obvious, and it needs to be maintained. For example, no one should care what words a prime minister or president uses when speaking in private to his spouse or friends. Now, of course, that still matters, how you behave in private too, because the Lord will judge those sins. And ultimately, what is private will become public usually. Nothing is hidden that won't be revealed. But if the leader of their country, or for that matter any public official, deliberately used expletives in public speeches, there would be shock and likely, especially if repeated, calls for the individual's removal from office. And in one humorous and probably apocryphal instance, it was said that whenever Miss Truman was told to stop her husband, President Harry Truman, from using the expression horse manure to refer to ideas he disliked, she answered, "It took me 25 years to get him to use that, expression." And the same is true for other types of offensive speech. If a person says bigoted things about another group to his or her spouse or to close friends in private, it's certainly unfortunate, but it's not necessarily significant, whereas saying bigoted things against an individual or group in public is very destructive. And the 37th President of the U.S., Richard Nixon, he was recorded making anti-Jewish comments in private. And when these recordings were made public, many Jews and others concluded that Nixon was an anti-Semite. And also, you can be considered an anti-Semite if you don't fully support Israel these days. Yep. But, of course, Israel's not perfect either. So, I don't support everything they do. And I don't think we should be wasting, a lot of money, trying to help them fight their own battles. When, I guess they can, fight battles themselves. We need to focus on our own problems, first and foremost. And also, by the way, probably the reason the Epstein files are not being released is because, Epstein was working probably with the Israeli foreign agency or whatever. So anyway, all right, I kind of wanted to throw that in there, but that's not being anti-Semitic. So, but anyway, all right. But Nixon was considered an anti-Semite for what he had to say about Jews in private, and he was widely condemned as such. But this man saved the Jewish state during the Yom Kippur War of 1973 by immediately sending armaments and supplies to enable Israel to defend itself against a surprise Arab onslaught launched on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, an attack which caught Israel completely off guard. Well aware many American Jews disliked Nixon, Golda Meir, the Israeli Prime Minister during the Yom Kippur War. Yeah, they never ceased to emphasize Nixon's critical role in ensuring Israel's survival. And nor was Golda Meir alone. In the Israeli newspaper Haaretz or whatever, which is a newspaper only the Israeli left and no supporter of Nixon, wrote many years later. So Nixon stands out among the presidents for taking the boldest risk for Israel. And more, Nixon saved Israel despite the fact that he had little political support among American Jews. And of course, if they need, help with maybe some weapons and all that, maybe that's not a bad thing, to, help, give stuff like that to them. But again, we have our own issues we need to deal with. So I don't want to, keep getting involved in, other people's problems. I mean, even if it's with an ally, and it's not good for the country. It's definitely not good for debt because we have to pay, dollars. So, but anyway. But I'm still hoping Israel will know the real Messiah Jesus at some point. Yeah. And likewise, as David McCullough, an author of a Pulitzer Prize winning biography of American President Harry S. Truman, he wrote this. And Truman on occasion referred to Jews as kikes or whatever in private correspondence, but yet Truman's closest friend was a Jew, and against the entire advice of the U.S. State Department, Truman recognized the State of Israel on May 14th, 1948, the very day that the state was established. So the lesson here basically is, in general, is this. People should not be judged by their private speech. Now, of course, the Lord will judge that. But anyway. But we all emote in private, and that in the case of Truman, that was the environment which he was raised. And similarly, and again, based on Truman's upbringing and private conversation, he sometimes used a racist word when referring to black people, but he was also the president who racially integrated the American Armed Forces. If everything people said privately were made public, each one of us would be deemed guilty of some offense. And private speech may tell us something or perhaps nothing about the person's character, and therefore it's none of our business. We shouldn't judge what people... Now, we should judge what people say in public, not what they say in private. So now the Lord will also judge the private as well as the public. And if the Lord wants to reveal private sins, with an individual, maybe to expose them and maybe give them a chance to repent, well, then he'll do that. So sometimes that might happen. But if not in this life, then everything will be exposed in the next. So today's the day of salvation. In that case, repent so your sins may be blotted out. Alright, judging people by what they say in private is the road to totalitarianism. Totalitarian regimes demand citizens report to the authorities what their neighbors or even family members say in private. And of course, in 1984, you had the thought police. And even what you thought or said in private, if it was against the party, that was considered a thought crime, and they could come after you. Yeah, so... And of course, you had telescreens watching you. So, but anyway, but that's the example of totalitarianism in 1984. So, and warning about that stuff. So, a friend who grew up in the Soviet Union remembered teachers telling him to report if their parents spoke critically of their government or made jokes about the country's leaders in his home. Yeah, that even happened in 1984. where the party had this thing called junior spies, where basically they were indoctrinating the children to basically report anything that would happen against the party, or like any speech against it, thought crimes. They would report that stuff to the thought police, even if it was their own parents. And I remember even in the book, one character actually got in trouble, yeah, with the thought police. Yeah, his own kids actually turned him in. Yeah, so anyway. So, but that's insane. Yep. And judging private speech made all the more possible thanks to modern recording devices is fraught with peril. And examples of the great difference between public and private abound. Is there not an enormous difference between relieving oneself in private and doing so in public, or walking around naked in private or in public, or driving through a stop sign in the middle of the night when no one is present to see you do it, as opposed to doing it in the middle of the day when others will see you do it? Now, both are illegal, but the latter is also immoral, because driving through a stop sign when others can see us, it undermines society's rules. And no society can tolerate such behavior, but what we do and say in public, it deeply affects the society. And a free society cannot survive if it judges private speech. And it cannot survive if it does not judge public speech. Now, of course, that's not saying that you censor speech that you disagree with. Yeah, but what you say, does matter, basically. Alright, and now you get to another essay. Now, this one's a little bit shorter. Why did Moses not know what to do with this public Sabbath violator? So verse 34, he was placed in custody, for it had not been specified what should be done to him. Now, this is a puzzling verse. How could Moses not know what to do with the man who publicly violated the Sabbath? Has God not already stated in Exodus 31:15, on the seventh day there shall be a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does work on the Sabbath shall be put to death? So according to virtually all traditional Jewish sources, from the Talmud to the medieval Bible commentators, Moses and the community well knew the penalty for such deliberately, let alone publicly, violating the Sabbath. Therefore, Moses was asking only how to execute the man, whether via stoning or in some other way. And this may be the case. But there are quite a few, I believe, compelling arguments that make the case that Moses was not asking how to execute the man, but what to do with him. So first, it's hard to imagine that Moses had no idea how to execute the man. Now, while stoning is not the only form of execution mentioned in the Torah, it's by far the most common. Unless another mode was specified, stoning was assumed to be the method. And it's worth noting that aside from this one instance, we know of no other Jew who has ever been executed for violating the Sabbath. And second, when the Torah says a person shall be put to death, it often does not specify the method. And third, God responded in the next verse, the man shall be put to death. This is a response to the question, what shall we do with this man? Not, how shall we put him to death? If Moses was asking how the man should be put to death, wouldn't God have simply responded, stone him? And that alone suggests that Moses was asking what should be done with the man, not by what method the man should be executed. Fourth, Jacob Milgram's argument for Moses' not knowing what to do with the man is that when the Torah lists the death penalty for deliberate Sabbath violation, it does so only within the context of building the tabernacle. Mishkan, which is the portable sanctuary used by the Israelites in the wilderness. And the death penalty for violating the Sabbath, he writes, is only prescribed in the context of building the tabernacle, to indicate that the need to build the sanctuary should not overrule the required Sabbath rest. And therefore, Moses would not know what to do with the man who violated the Shabbat in a context unrelated to building the tabernacle. Okay, maybe so. And a fifth possible explanation is Moses knew the laws against both work and kindling a fire on the Sabbath, but before, executing the man, Moses wanted to make sure that this is what God really wanted. And given Moses' character and concern for his people, that is possibly what prompted his question, what shall be done with this man? Alright, now you get to another essay, which this is another long essay. Why was the man executed for gathering wood on the Sabbath? Alright, verse 35. So then the Lord said to Moses, the man shall be put to death, the whole community shall pelt him with stones outside the camp. And whatever Moses was asking, God responded that the man deserved the death penalty, which raises the most important question. Why is violating the Sabbath the only ritual act in the Torah that carries the death penalty? And why specifically was the wood gatherer put to death? The reason is the Sabbath is not only ritual. It's not only a ritual. It's about the very basis of the Torah and Torah monotheism. God, not gods, not chance, not nature, created the world, and therefore the world has meaning. The Sabbath primarily is the primary means of expressing the first message of the Bible, that God created the world. And without that affirmation, nothing makes sense. If there's no creator, then creation is ultimately meaningless. If there is no commander, there are no binding commandments. And this is why the first verse in the Bible, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, might be considered the most important verse of the Bible, in the Bible. Now, of course, for Prager, again, that would just be the Old Testament. And the Sabbath is also a sign of the covenant between God and Israel, Exodus 31, 16 through 17. And if there's no Sabbath, there's no sign of the covenant between God and Israel. And if there's no covenant, there's no raison d'etre for Israel. And moreover, the Sabbath is in the Ten Commandments, the central moral document of Israel and of the Bible, the document that forms the moral foundation of Western civilization. And with the obvious exception of the Ten Commandments, because it is a thought, not an action, each of the Ten Commandments that prohibits a specific action carries the death penalty. Commandments 6, 7, and 9, murder, adultery, and bearing false witness in a capital case are subject to the death penalty. Deuteronomy 19, 18 through 21. Commandment 8, do not steal, is also a capital offense. Exodus 21:16, because it refers above all to stealing human beings in order to sell them into slavery. In light of this fact, it is puzzling how any believing Jew or Christian could have defended the transatlantic slave trade. Yeah, which obviously went against that verse, which I think is do not kidnap another person. And Commandment 1, in the Jewish enumeration, the first commandment is an affirmation of God's existence and his having liberated the Israelites from Egyptian bondage, as it does not involve a specific action and it cannot carry the death penalty. And Commandments 2 and 5, the commandments prohibiting public idol worship and striking a parent, Exodus 21:15, thereby violating the fifth commandment, honor your father and mother, were also capital offenses, though certainly in the case of parents, we do not have a record of this punishment being carried out. And also, of course, the parents could not put their child to death. In Commandment 3, this is a general command prohibiting committing evil in God's name. And to understand this commandment, see discussions at Exodus 20, verse 7 and Deuteronomy 5:11. You can go check out the Deuteronomy 5 videos. I forgot what part the third commandment's talked in. It may be part 1 or part 2, but anyway. As it does not prohibit a specific act, and because it states that God himself will deal with this sinner, no death penalty is necessarily involved. Although part of taking God's name in vain, it's not just, cussing, but it's also, of course, speaking lies in God's name, giving false prophecies. And a false prophet would be put to death in the under the Mosaic covenant. An Israelite who deliberately and publicly violated the Sabbath during the first days of Israel's existence, and who presumably planned to engage in the one act specifically prohibited on the Sabbath, kindling a fire. The portable reason for this ban is also explained in Exodus 35:3. But basically deliberately violating the Sabbath and undermined the founding document of Israel and its covenant with God. And however, this story was not intended to serve as a precedent for all cases in which an Israelite violates the Sabbath. And there is no recorded incident of a person executed for violating the Sabbath in the Bible or since the Bible, despite the fact that we have innumerable examples of Jews violating the Sabbath. And the Torah here describes a one-time event which took place under unique circumstances. That critical period when the identity and purpose of the Israelite Jewish people was forged. And later, once the Torah was established as the Israelites' code of behavior, a Jew who publicly desecrated the Sabbath did not pose a threat to Israel's existence. And people who dismiss the moral advancements of the Bible, they sometimes cite this story as an example of biblical immorality. But what was Moses supposed to do with the man who, weeks after the nation received the 10 Commandments, publicly decided to rebel against their moral authority and that of God and Moses? Fine him, admonish him, ignore him? And more importantly, those critics of the Bible do not understand or do not wish to acknowledge that the very book that they hold in contempt gave them and their society virtually every noble ideal that they claim to hold. It is this Torah that 3,200 years ago created such principles as love your neighbor as yourself, Leviticus 19:18, and also love the stranger, Leviticus 19:34, that gave the world a God who loves human beings. The concept of moral goodness, universal morality, liberty as a societal goal, and virtually every other moral idea that made Western civilization the uniquely moral and scientifically advanced civilization it became. And as regards the Sabbath, the commandment to observe the Sabbath gave the world the first notion of moral obligations to animals and to those who work for others. Whether as an employee, an indentured servant, or even as a slave, they too must have a weekly day of rest. And ultimately, if Jesus is our Sabbath rest, then it's ultimately very severe if you don't want to rest in Him, and I guess violate the Sabbath. And you will suffer eternal consequences if you ultimately if you do reject Jesus, where you should find your rest for your souls. And find, love and joy and satisfaction that only He can give, and not find it in your sin that'll ultimately give you the death sentence. Alright, and verse 36. So the whole community took him outside the camp and stoned him to death, as the Lord commanded Moses. And of course, Jesus was executed outside the camp. He wasn't stoned, he was crucified. Even though he didn't do anything wrong, but he took our punishment for violating the law. Yeah. And finally, as the Israelites did not have an official executor, the whole community was responsible for enforcing its legal code. The whole community likely refers to representatives of the community. And then the Lord said to Moses as follows: Speak to the Israelite people and instruct them to make for themselves fringes on the corners of their garments throughout the ages. So these fringes, tzedit, however you say that in Hebrew, are the most familiar today as the strings that would hang from the corners of a talit, which is the Jewish prayer shawl. In the ancient world, however, tzedit were worn on the hem of a man's robe. And as Milgram explains, the hem was particularly an ornate part of a garment, a symbolic extension of the wearer's person and authority. So in the most observant circles, tzedit, however you say it. It's hard to say that because, it's Hebrew. But they are attached to an undershirt and worn all day. And during much of Jewish history, many Jews wore that, tucked in because they feared publicizing their being Jews, given the anti-Semitism which prevailed throughout so much of Jewish history. And today, however, with the existence of an open and relatively tolerant societies, and in Israel, many observant Jews wear the fringes untucked and therefore visible. And the Torah does not link this law with the preceding episode of the man who publicly violated the Sabbath, but we can conjecture. The answer may lie in the reason for, the fringes in verse 39, which I'll get to pretty soon. Look at it and recall all the commandments of the Lord and observe them. So if the man who publicly desecrated the Sabbath had been wearing these fringes, he may not have done what he did. And let them attach a cord of blue to the fringe at each corner. So one of the fringes is to be a blue cord. So the blue was obtained by extracting dye from the gland of a particular snail, the murex. And it was used for royal garments in many places in the Mediterranean area. And according to Alter, I guess just another scholar, wearing fringes with its royal blue conferred on the individual Jew that he too was nobility, a member of the kingdom of priests, Exodus 19:16. And of course, even Christians are considered, priests. We have access to the Father through Jesus. And since the dye was rare and an extraction and preparation of this dye was labor intensive, and in later times the dye became too costly for most Jews to afford this blue colored thread, and nearly all fringes therefore became entirely white. And today, however, the practice of the blue colored thread has been revived in Israel, and it's commonly seen in synagogues throughout the land. Alright, and I think this is the second to last essay, so I'm getting close. All right, essay. The potential power of the fringes and of religion. All right, verse 39. So that shall be your fringe. Look at it and recall all the commandments of the Lord and observe them. So tzedit, it may be considered ethical and holy, strings around the finger, just as people would tie a string around their finger to remind them to perform some task. A Jew was supposed to look at these fringes and be reminded to act in accordance with Torah values. And perhaps the most romantic and quite possibly the most unexpected story in the Talmud concerns tzedit. Yeah. Again, hard to say that word. Alright, well, here's this story. I mean, I don't believe in the Talmud, but I'll go ahead, and read this. Now, a certain man who, is scrupulous, it's hard to say that. Scrupulously, there we go, scrupulously observed the law of tzedit. And he heard of a prostitute in a far-off land who demanded 400 gold coins as her price, and he sent her 400 gold coins, and he set a date to meet her. And when the day arrived, he waited by the prostitute's door. Her maid came and told her, "The man who sent you 400 gold coins is waiting at the door." And the woman replied, "Let him come in." And when he entered, the prostitute went to her bed and laid down upon it naked. And he too started toward her bed, and all of a sudden the 4 ritual fringes on his garment flew up and struck him in the face. Struck him across the face, and at that point he moved away from her and he sat down on the ground. And the prostitute stepped down from her bed and sat down on the ground opposite him. And she swore, "By the head of the Roman emperor, I will not leave you alone until you tell me what blemish you saw in me that caused you to leave my bed." And then he replied, "Never have I seen a woman as beautiful as you are, but there is a commandment which the Lord our God has commanded us. It's called tzedit." And he went on to explain that the fringes are intended to remind the people to observe God's commandments. And now the 4 fringes of the tzedit appeared to me as 4 witnesses, testifying before God about the sin I was about to commit with you. And then the prostitute said, "I will not let you leave here until you tell me your name, the name of your town, the name of your teacher, or the name of the school in which you study the Torah." And then he wrote this all down and put it in her hand. And then thereupon the man departed from home, and the woman traveled to a yeshiva headed by Rabbi Haya, and said to him, "Master, instruct the rabbis to convert me to Judaism." "My daughter," he replied, "perhaps you have set your eyes on one of my students." And then she took out the paper that young man had given to her and handed it to Rabbi Haya, who would recognize the handwriting and identify the fact that she had fallen in love with one of his students and with Judaism. So the woman was converted and immediately married the young man. And so the Talmud concludes, the very linens she had spread out for him for an illicit purpose, she now spread out for him lawfully. So this story basically illustrates the potential power of the tzedit strings. The tzedit strings could prevent a young man from sleeping with the beautiful prostitute. They could probably prevent most sins. Yeah. Well, ultimately, really, the main thing would be, to believe in the Messiah, and ultimately, you can be changed from even wanting to do that stuff. But yeah. So, I mean, you can even refuse to, not do that, which is a good thing, and still not be saved. So, but anyway. Alright, and now I guess this is the final essay. The heart is not to be trusted. Yep, so that you do not follow your heart and eyes in your lustful age. So the literal meaning of the Hebrew word translated here as follow, tatoru, however you say that, it means scout out. It's the verb used to describe the activity of the spies in Numbers 13 to scout out the land. And the Tzedet are intended to prevent the individual from scouting out whatever immoral or illicit thing that he yearns for. Your lustful urge is not an accurate translation of the Hebrew, which is Asher, Atim, Zonim, Akrahim, however you say that. And the words here mean after which you prostitute yourselves, or whoring in some translations. People prostitute themselves when they sacrifice their values and convictions and act on the desires of their heart and eyes. And the Torah uses such strong language here that it uses that strong language. It demonstrates how negatively the Torah and the rest of the Bible views the heart as a guide to human conduct. In addition to this verse in Numbers, the book of Jeremiah warns people not to follow their hearts, because most devious is the heart, it is perverse, who can fathom it? Or the heart is deceitful and desperately wicked, who can know it? Jeremiah 17:9. And the book of Proverbs actually says this: he that trusts in his own heart is a fool, but whoever walks in wisdom will be delivered from foolishness. And I think I'm trying to remember what proverb that is. Let me see if I can find that. Proverbs 28:26. That's where that is. Although the JPS translation renders this verse differently, the literal Jewish translation of the second half of Genesis 8:21 is, the tendency of man's heart is toward evil from his youth. And one of the consequences of the Bibles is playing a diminishing role in people's lives and the life of society is that we have come to live in what can be characterized as the age of feelings. Feelings have supplanted moral codes and reason. In an interview I recorded with a Swedish graduate student decades before writing this commentary, I began asking her whether she believed in any religion. "Of course not," she responded. "Well, do you believe in God?" "Of course not." "Well then, where do you get your notion of right and wrong?" "From my heart." So the great moral question is this: who is more likely to be a good person? Well, no one is good biblically. According to the Bible, being good is being perfect, and none of us are that. But I guess, for Prager, being a good person would be, treating other people well and, being responsible. Basically good behavior. I mean, which is, good, but it's not, biblically good ultimately, because it doesn't deal with your sin. Yep. And as sinners, we want to follow our heart. Yeah, well, that's ultimately where our sinful desires and ultimately our actions spring from. So we need a heart change. We need regeneration. We need to be born again, as Jesus said. So who is more likely to be a, good person, as Prager would define it? One who follows his or her heart, or one who follows a moral code rooted in the Torah? Those who follow their heart, or those who follow the Ten Commandments? To be sure, now, there are good people, of course not biblically speaking, who follow their hearts, and there are bad people who claim to follow the Torah, or a non-Jewish Torah-based code. or probably false Christians, I guess. Regarding the latter, the medieval Jewish commentator Nachmanides, or Ramban, however we say that, he wrote that a person can be disgusting with the permission of the Torah. Naval Bershat HaTorah. I guess that's the Hebrew for that phrase. Nothing, not even a God-based code, guarantees moral people. Humans are ingenious at devising ways to violate the spirit of the law, even while maintaining fidelity to the letter of the law. Basically, being hypocritical, maybe trying to look good on the outside but are dead on the inside. Kind of like the Pharisees in the New Testament. There are, for example, awful drivers who nevertheless observe all traffic laws. But we have an immeasurably greater chance of producing good people if people follow a good code, especially if they believe it emanates from God, than if everyone follows their own heart. But of course, even trying to follow the law, you can't be saved even trying to do that. You need to be given a new heart. Follow your heart is a widely offered piece of advice in the contemporary period, but it's awful advice in virtually every area of life, from ethics to eating. And moreover, it's hard to imagine that those who advocate for it really believe in it. Not whenever, somebody does wrong to them. Is anyone who advocates that people follow their heart prepared to dispense with laws? Should people follow their heart regarding how much taxes should be paid? Should males be raised with this advice? When you see a woman whom you are attracted, let your heart dictate how you should treat her? Should men or women who covet their neighbor's spouse follow their heart? No! Repent of that. Name a law that society can drop and replace with follow your heart. Beginning in the 1960s, however, many American high schools embraced a program known as values clarification. It was not about values education, but about values clarification, based on how the students felt about a given subject or situation. Students' feelings about right and wrong determined right and wrong. And as described by Professor William G. Thompson of East Tennessee State University, he said this: in the 1960s and 70s, character education changed dramatically when values clarification replaced the traditional emphasis on learning right from wrong and acting right. And these programs failed to distinguish between the personal preferences of students and true moral values. The teacher never attempted to influence the student and withheld his or her personal opinions. Whatever values the student arrived at were to be respected by the teacher. Why then do people believe their heart suffices as a guide? Because it's far easier to let one's heart be its own guide than to act in accordance with reason in a higher code, especially one emanating from God. And also because we want to be our own God. We suppress the truth of God in unrighteousness. We have a basic knowledge of what is right and what is wrong, but yet we don't want to do that because we want to do what's right in our own eyes. We love the darkness rather than the light. So that's why we need a Savior. We need a new heart with new desires who love God. And that can only happen by coming to Jesus. And because many people believe that people are basically good, and particularly believe that about themselves, and probably even many that would call themselves Christians, they regard following their heart as a fine guide to living a good life. But human nature is not basically, let alone consistently, good. It's not good at all. No one does good, not even one. No one is righteous, not even one. That's even in the Old Testament. It's just quoted in the New. Therefore, following one's heart will actually lead to far more bad than good. Yeah, especially with this postmodern stuff, which is really just all about, whatever's true for you or whatever's true for me. It's pretty much following your heart, basically, on what you think is true. Yeah, but there's no such thing as your truth or my truth. There's only the truth. And as Ben Shapiro says, facts don't care about your feelings. Yeah, especially, biblical truth, ultimately. It doesn't care about your feelings. Really, it would actually offend your feelings. Yeah. So, as supposed to. Yeah, if your feelings are pointed towards the wrong things. And I have learned in the 4th grade in yeshiva, which is Orthodox Jewish school, that I could not rely on my feelings to determine how I behaved. And one afternoon, the rabbis announced, "Boys, it's time to daven mincha," which is to recite afternoon prayers. And as I didn't feel like reciting the afternoon prayers, I walked over to the rabbi and I said to him respectably, "Rabbi, I'm not in the mood to do this." And even as a 4th grader, it was apparent to me that the rabbi probably never before encountered such an objection to prayer. And in fact, I have ever since wondered if he had ever before heard the words mood and devon in the same sentence. And he stroked his beard and he thought for a moment, and then calling me by my Hebrew name, Shemuel Prager, is not in the mood to devon mincha. So what? The rabbi's dismissal of my feelings with this "so what" changed my life. While feelings are a major part of what makes us human, as a determiner of conduct, they merit little more than so what. Yeah, well, I feel like, the Lord wants me to do this thing, even though it's sinful. So what? It's sinful. And then, and this is obvious in the moral realm, but it's true in every spiritual life. You are overweight and feel, like you are overweight and feel like having more dessert. So what? You have a monthly mortgage to pay and don't feel like going to work. So what? The Torah's warning against following the heart is one of myriad examples of why a Bible-based education is likely to make a person wiser than a secular education, which in my lifetime has advocated heart-based values and actions. Yep, and it's led to, destruction in society. Yeah, universities are a mess. And really, leftism ultimately appeals to emotions. Yeah. Alright, verses 40 through 41. Thus you shall be reminded to observe all my commandments and be holy to your God. 41. I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am your God, the Lord. Alright, well, that's the end of Numbers 15, and Lord willing, I'll get to 16 next time, but until then, may God bless you, and the grace and mercy won by Jesus, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you all.